Principal Daniel Brooks believed that by lunchtime the woman standing near the entrance would be gone, and the entire incident would be forgotten before the final school bell rang. What he did not know was that 10 seconds can feel very long when an entire room suddenly realizes it judged the wrong person. Lincoln Heights Academy was the kind of school that appeared in local magazines every spring. Red brick buildings stood beneath enormous maple trees. Banners celebrating academic championships hung from polished hallways, and parents often waited months just for the chance to attend an admissions interview. On that cool September morning, the main auditorium buzzed with conversation as families gathered for the annual district education meeting. Teachers organized paperwork near the stage while students wearing school uniforms hurried between rows of chairs carrying programs and bottled water. Near the entrance stood Sarah Mitchell. She wore a simple cream sweater, dark slacks, and comfortable shoes that looked more practical than fashionable. Her light brown hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and a plain leather folder remained tucked beneath one arm. She looked less like someone attending an executive meeting and more like someone waiting for a bus on a quiet street corner. Most people never noticed her when they walked by. That morning was different. Sarah stepped toward the registration table and offered a polite smile to the woman checking names against a list. "Good morning," Sarah said softly. "I am here for the district session." The woman glanced up briefly before looking back down at the paperwork. "Parents should use the east entrance," she replied without looking at her again. Sarah remained calm. "I am not here as a parent." The woman finally looked up. Her eyes moved from Sarah's sweater to the folder in her hand, and then back to her face. "Staff credentials?" she asked. "I do not have one." The expression on the woman's face changed immediately. Nearby conversations began slowing as people sensed tension forming near the entrance. A security officer approached with the careful confidence of someone who expected an easy conversation. "Ma'am," he said politely, "this meeting is restricted to authorized guests and district personnel." Sarah nodded slightly. "I understand. Then I am going to have to ask you to wait outside while we sort this out." Several parents nearby turned to watch. A few students stopped walking altogether. Sarah glanced toward the auditorium where teachers prepared presentation slides beneath bright stage lights. Then she looked back toward the security officer. "There has probably been a misunderstanding," she said gently. Before anyone could answer, another voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the problem here?" Principal Daniel Brooks had arrived. The room became quieter almost instantly as the respected principal stepped forward and looked directly at the woman standing alone near the doors. Principal Brooks listened quietly as the security officer explained the situation. The registration volunteer stood nearby holding her clipboard, while several parents pretended not to watch the conversation unfolding only a few feet away. Brooks nodded once before turning towards Sarah with the practiced professionalism that had helped him lead Lincoln Heights Academy for more than a decade. "Good morning," he said politely. "I am Principal Brooks. I understand there may have been some confusion regarding your attendance today." Sarah offered a small smile. "I believe so." Brooks glanced toward the registration table. "This meeting is limited to district officials, invited guests, faculty members, and registered parents." His tone remained respectful, but firm enough for nearby families to hear. "Can you tell me which category applies to you?" Sarah adjusted the leather folder beneath her arm. "I am here for the district session." Brooks nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand that part. But what is your role exactly?" Sarah hesitated briefly. "I believe my office sent the information earlier this week." Brooks exchanged a quick look with the registration volunteer, who immediately shook her head. "We have no record of her on the list," she said. The principal's expression tightened slightly. Around them, conversations inside the auditorium had started slowing as more people noticed what was happening near the entrance. A pair of teachers carrying presentation materials paused near the hallway doors. Several students sitting near the front rows turned in their seats to watch. Brooks folded his hands in front of him. "Ma'am, I appreciate that misunderstandings happen, but events like this require advance authorization." Sarah remained perfectly calm. "Of course. Without verification, I cannot allow access to the session." Sarah nodded again. "I understand your position." The simplicity of her answer seemed to surprise him. There was no argument, no frustration, no raised voice, only patience. The principal glanced toward the growing audience nearby and appeared eager to resolve the situation quickly. Perhaps if you contact whoever invited you, we can clear this up later. One of the parents standing nearby quietly whispered something to her husband and shook her head. Another parent crossed his arms and looked towards Sarah with open skepticism. Brooks noticed the attention gathering around them and lowered his voice slightly. Until then, I am going to ask that you step outside the auditorium. The security officer shifted his weight politely beside the door. Sarah looked toward the stage where district banners hung behind rows of empty seats reserved for speakers and officials. Then she looked back toward Principal Brooks. "May I ask for 10 seconds?" she said softly. Brooks raised an eyebrow. The registration volunteer looked confused. A teacher near the hallway gave a small laugh under her breath. 10 seconds. Brooks repeated. Sarah nodded. That should be enough. For a moment, the principal studied her expression, perhaps expecting anxiety or desperation. Instead, he found only calm certainty. Finally, he glanced at his watch and gave a small nod. Very well, he said. You have 10 seconds. The room became quiet enough for everyone nearby to hear the ticking clock mounted above the auditorium doors. Sarah looked up at the clock mounted above the auditorium entrance. 10 seconds. That was all she had asked for. Not a speech. Not an argument. Not even an explanation. Around her, conversations had stopped almost completely. Parents stood beside registration tables pretending to organize papers they were no longer reading. Teachers lingered near the doorway holding folders that suddenly seemed far less important than the scene unfolding in front of them. Even several students sitting inside the auditorium leaned into the aisle for a better view. Principal Brooks glanced down at his watch and nodded once. Your 10 seconds have started, he said calmly. Sarah offered a small smile and reached into the leather folder beneath her arm. The movement itself seemed to disappoint some of the people watching. Several had expected frustration. Others expected excuses. Instead, she removed her phone and opened a single email message. Her expression never changed. For seconds passed. 5. The security officer shifted awkwardly near the door. The registration volunteer folded her arms and looked away toward the stage as though the matter had already been settled. Then Sarah quietly turned the phone toward Principal Brooks. Would you mind reading the sender's name? She asked softly. Brooks accepted the phone almost automatically. His eyes moved to the top of the message. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then his expression changed. The transformation was small at first. His eyebrows tightened slightly. His eyes returned to the sender line a second time. Then a third. Nearby parents noticed it immediately. The confidence that had carried him through the conversation only moments earlier seemed to pause somewhere behind his eyes. Brooks looked up at Sarah, then back at the phone. The hallway had become so quiet that the distant sound of a student locker closing somewhere down the corridor echoed toward the entrance. This email, Brooks began before stopping himself. Sarah remained silent. Brooks cleared his throat and looked again at the message displayed on the screen. The registration volunteer stepped closer. Is there a problem? She asked quietly. Brooks did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the stage where district officials were preparing their presentations and then back toward the woman standing in front of him. Ma'am, he said carefully, would you mind telling me your full name? Sarah adjusted the folder beneath her arm. Sarah Mitchell. The principal froze for half a second. One of the teachers standing nearby suddenly looked confused. The name clearly meant something to him. The registration volunteer looked from Sarah to the principal and back again. Wait, the teacher whispered. Brooks slowly handed the phone back to Sarah. The confidence had disappeared from his posture completely now. You are Sarah Mitchell from the District Education Oversight Board? Sarah nodded once. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the ticking clock above the auditorium entrance somehow sounded louder than before. 7 seconds had passed. 3 more seconds passed before anyone in the hallway remembered how to speak. Principal Brooks looked toward the registration volunteer, who now stared back at him with the same confusion that had spread across the faces of the parents nearby. The security officer slowly lowered his hands from his belt and took half a step backward without realizing he had done it. Sarah simply stood where she had been standing from the beginning, her expression calm and unchanged. Brooks cleared his throat once. Mrs. Mitchell, he said carefully, I was not informed that you would be attending personally. Sarah offered a polite smile. That seems to be the source of the misunderstanding. The principal nodded quickly. Of course it is. The confidence that had filled his voice only moments earlier had vanished completely. One of the teachers near the doorway looked toward another faculty member and quietly whispered, "She is the Mitchell?" The other teacher nodded almost immediately. Apparently, the name had traveled through district meetings long before her face had. Sarah glanced toward the auditorium where district representatives continued preparing reports and budget presentations beneath bright stage lighting. "I apologize for arriving without additional notice," she said softly. "I was already in the area and decided to attend in person rather than joining remotely." Principal Brooks shook his head. "No apology is necessary." He stopped speaking for a moment before correcting himself. "Actually, I believe the apology belongs elsewhere." The registration volunteer looked down at the clipboard in her hands. The security officer suddenly seemed very interested in the floor tiles beneath his shoes. Nearby parents exchanged uncomfortable glances as they replayed the last several minutes in their minds. Sarah noticed all of it and ignored all of it. "I understand why procedures exist," she said gently. "Schools should be careful about security." Brooks nodded immediately. "Yes, absolutely." Then he hesitated. "However, assumptions should not replace questions." The words landed softly but heavily. Nobody argued with them because nobody could. The clock above the auditorium entrance continued ticking quietly overhead. 9 seconds had passed. A teacher near the stage doors looked toward the principal and then toward Sarah before speaking carefully. "Mrs. Mitchell serves as chair of the District Education Oversight Board." The words spread through the hallway almost instantly. Parents who had only been half listening suddenly stood a little straighter. Students looked toward Sarah with open curiosity. Even teachers who had not recognized her name moments earlier suddenly understood why district superintendents returned phone calls so quickly when she was involved. Brooks looked toward his watch one final time. 10 seconds. Exactly 10 seconds earlier, he had been preparing to escort her out of the building. Now the principal of Lincoln Heights Academy stood silently beside the entrance, wondering how many opportunities for respect had been missed before a title finally entered the conversation. Principal Brooks opened the auditorium doors himself. Only minutes earlier, he had been prepared to escort Sarah outside. Now he stepped aside and held the door for her with the careful respect usually reserved for governors, superintendents, and visiting officials. Sarah thanked him with a simple nod and walked inside as conversations slowly faded around her. The district meeting had not yet started, but word had already begun moving through the room faster than any official announcement could have traveled. Teachers whispered quietly to one another near the stage. Parents glanced toward Sarah and then immediately looked away when she noticed them. Several district representatives stood from their seats as she approached. One of them crossed the room and greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Mitchell, we were expecting you to join remotely." Sarah smiled politely. "So was I." A few people nearby laughed softly, relieved to hear warmth in her voice rather than frustration. Principal Brooks remained standing near the entrance for a moment longer than necessary. The registration volunteer quietly organized papers that no longer needed organizing. The security officer adjusted the radio on his shoulder and avoided looking toward the stage entirely. Sarah noticed none of it. Or perhaps she simply chose not to. She took a seat near the front row and placed her leather folder on the table beside a printed copy of the district budget proposal. The meeting began moments later. Presentation slides appeared on the giant screen while district officials discussed enrollment projections, technology funding, transportation costs, and teacher retention programs. Sarah listened carefully and occasionally made notes in the margins of her documents. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the superintendent stepped toward the microphone. "Before we continue," he said, "I would like to recognize the chair of the District Education Oversight Board for joining us in person today." The room immediately turned toward Sarah. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell has overseen educational funding reviews across 12 schools in our district and has played a major role in expanding scholarship access for low-income students throughout the county." The silence inside the auditorium returned instantly. Several parents exchanged surprised looks. A teacher near the back slowly lowered his coffee cup. Principal Brooks looked toward Sarah with an expression that now contained equal parts respect and regret. The superintendent continued. "Many of the programs currently operating at Lincoln Heights Academy exist because of recommendations that originated from Mrs. Mitchell's office." Sarah stood briefly and acknowledged the room with a polite smile before returning to her seat. No speech. No celebration. No mention of what had happened near the entrance less than an hour earlier. Principal Brooks lowered his eyes toward the floor for a moment before looking back toward the woman he had nearly turned away from the very school benefiting from her work. The lesson arrived quietly, but it arrived all the same. Sometimes the most important credentials are not worn around a person's neck. Sometimes they are carried quietly in the way they treat people who have nothing to prove. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere inside the auditorium had changed in ways no presentation slide could explain. Numbers appeared on screens, charts moved across projectors, and discussions about budgets and staffing echoed through the room. Yet attention kept drifting back toward the woman sitting quietly near the front row with a notebook resting beside her folder. Sarah listened more than she spoke. When questions were raised about transportation funding, she asked about rural students who traveled nearly an hour each morning to reach school. When scholarship numbers appeared on the screen, she asked whether first-generation college applicants were being tracked separately. When technology investments were discussed, she asked whether students without reliable internet access at home had been considered in the planning process. Each question was simple. Each question revealed a level of understanding that reached far beyond budgets and spreadsheets. Principal Brooks found himself listening more carefully than he had all morning. During a short break, he approached Sarah near the refreshment table where untouched coffee cups sat beside trays of pastries. For a moment, he seemed uncertain how to begin. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked up from the notes she had been reviewing. "For what?" she asked gently. Brooks gave a small smile that carried very little humor. "For deciding who you were before I asked who you were." Nearby conversations faded into the background. Sarah closed her folder slowly. "You were protecting your school," she replied. "That part was never the problem." Brooks nodded once. "The problem was that I assumed someone dressed simply and standing alone could not possibly belong in that room." Sarah held his gaze for a moment before answering. "Most people do not notice they are making assumptions until after the damage is done." The principal looked down briefly before speaking again. "I have spent 20 years telling students not to judge each other by appearances." He glanced around the auditorium filled with banners celebrating character and leadership. Apparently, adults need the reminder just as much. Sarah smiled softly. "Education works both ways." The words settled quietly between them. Across the room, parents who had witnessed the events near the entrance earlier that morning watched the conversation unfold with expressions very different from the ones they had worn before. Respect had replaced suspicion. Curiosity had replaced judgment. A few minutes later, the superintendent called everyone back to their seats. As Sarah returned to the front row, several teachers greeted her by name for the first time that day. One parent thanked her for expanding district scholarship programs. Another introduced herself and spoke proudly about her daughter's college plans. Nothing about Sarah had changed since she first walked through the doors that morning. The same cream sweater, the same leather folder, the same quiet voice. The only thing that had changed was what people believed those things meant. Sometimes dignity arrives with applause. Sometimes it arrives with silence. And sometimes it arrives exactly 10 seconds after the world decides it already knows your story. The afternoon session moved into policy discussions, but the conversation that stayed with people had happened long before the first slide presentation appeared on the screen. Sarah remained focused on the work in front of her. She reviewed proposals, highlighted funding concerns, and listened carefully as school leaders from across the district shared their challenges. Principal Brooks noticed something unexpected as the meeting continued. Every time Sarah spoke, people listened differently. Not because of her position, not because of her title, but because every question she asked seemed designed to help students rather than impress adults. During a discussion about extracurricular budgets, Sarah asked how many students had stopped participating because transportation home was unavailable after evening activities. During a presentation about advanced placement programs, she asked whether first-generation college applicants were receiving enough guidance during the application process. One administrator quietly admitted they had never tracked the numbers. Sarah simply wrote something in her notebook and nodded. There was no criticism in her expression, only concern. Principal Brooks watched the exchange carefully. The image he had formed near the entrance that morning felt increasingly distant from the woman sitting a few rows away. Near the end of the session, the superintendent invited questions from the audience. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Principal Brooks slowly stood from his seat. The room turned toward him immediately. He looked toward Sarah before speaking into the microphone. This morning, he began carefully, our school received an unexpected lesson in education. A few people exchanged curious looks. Brooks continued, we spend a great deal of time teaching students about respect, inclusion, and fairness. Today I was reminded that those lessons do not stop when we become adults. The auditorium became very quiet. Sarah lowered her eyes toward the notebook resting in her lap. Brooks looked directly toward the audience. I made an assumption before I asked a question. I looked at appearance before I looked for understanding. That was my mistake. No one moved. The honesty in his voice left little room for discomfort or excuses. The registration volunteer, sitting near the back, slowly lowered her eyes toward the floor. The security officer folded his hands quietly in front of him. Brooks looked back toward Sarah one final time. Thank you for your grace this morning, he said. Sarah offered the same small smile she had worn since the beginning of the day. We all have moments that teach us something, she replied softly. The room remained silent for several seconds after she spoke. Outside the tall auditorium windows, autumn leaves moved gently across the campus sidewalks as students crossed between classes, unaware that one of the most important lessons taught at Lincoln Heights Academy that year had never appeared in a textbook. It had happened near the front doors, beside a registration table, in the space between assumption and understanding. When the final presentation ended, people did not rush toward the exits the way they usually did after district meetings. Conversations lingered in the aisles. Teachers stood in small groups discussing policies that had suddenly become personal. Parents gathered near the stage while students quietly helped collect programs and fold away empty chairs. Yet the center of attention remained the woman in the cream sweater, carefully placing her notes back into a worn leather folder. Sarah moved with the same quiet pace she had carried all morning. Nothing about her had changed. Principal Brooks noticed that detail more than any other. Titles had not changed her posture. Recognition had not changed her voice. Respect had not changed the way she treated people. As Sarah prepared to leave, a young teacher approached her near the auditorium doors. Mrs. Mitchell, she said nervously, I wanted to thank you for what you said earlier about scholarship access. Sarah stopped and listened carefully. The teacher explained that she had been the first person in her family to attend college, and that several of her students faced the same challenges she once had. Sarah smiled warmly. Then they already have someone important standing in front of them every day, she replied. The teacher lowered her eyes for a moment before smiling back. Nearby, the registration volunteer quietly walked towards Sarah with visible hesitation. Mrs. Mitchell, she said softly, I owe you an apology as well. Sarah looked at her kindly. You were doing your job. The woman shook her head gently. I was doing my job after I made a judgment first. Sarah considered her words for a moment. Then perhaps today was useful for both of us. The woman nodded slowly. There was relief in her expression now, not because she had escaped embarrassment, but because she had been given the opportunity to learn from it. Across the room, Principal Brooks watched the exchange unfold in silence. Schools spent enormous amounts of time teaching mathematics, science, history, and literature. Yet the lesson that seemed to matter most that day had arrived without a textbook, without a classroom, and without a lesson plan. A few minutes later, Sarah stepped into the hallway where afternoon sunlight stretched across polished floors and trophy cases reflected the orange colors of early autumn. Through the open doors, she could still hear the distant sounds of conversations continuing inside the auditorium. She paused for only a moment beside a display celebrating student leadership awards. Then Principal Brooks caught up with her once more. Mrs. Mitchell, he said quietly. Sarah turned toward him. The principal looked toward the rows of student photographs lining the walls before speaking. I think I understand something now that I should have understood years ago. Sarah waited patiently. Brooks smiled slightly. The students in these halls are always watching how adults treat people they believe have no power. The hallway became quiet. Sarah nodded once. That is why the example matters as much as the lesson. Neither of them spoke for several seconds after that. Some truths do not need additional words once they finally arrive. Sarah stepped toward the front doors of Lincoln Heights Academy, just as the final bell rang somewhere deep inside the building. The sound echoed softly through the hallways as students began spilling into corridors filled with backpacks, conversations, and the familiar energy that only schools seemed to carry in the late afternoon. She paused briefly near the entrance and adjusted the leather folder beneath her arm. Behind her, the auditorium doors opened once more and Principal Brooks stepped into the hallway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sunlight stretched across the polished floor between trophy cases and framed photographs celebrating decades of graduating classes. Brooks looked toward the students moving past them and smiled slightly. "They will never know what happened here today," he said quietly. Sarah followed his gaze toward the hallway filled with young faces preparing for futures they could not yet imagine. "Perhaps that is for the best," she replied. The principal nodded once. Then he looked toward the front entrance where the registration table still stood exactly where the morning had begun. The clipboard remained there. The visitor badges remained there. The only thing missing was the certainty everyone had felt when they first saw a woman standing quietly by herself near the doors. "I think this school learned something important today," Brooks said. Sarah smiled softly. "Schools are supposed to be places where people learn." The principal laughed quietly at that. Several students passed between them without recognizing either name or title. To them, she was simply another visitor walking through the building. Somehow that felt appropriate. Sarah extended her hand, and Brooks shook it gratefully. "Thank you for your patience this morning," he said. "Thank you for listening this afternoon," she answered. Then she turned and walked toward the parking lot beneath rows of maple trees, beginning to show the first colors of autumn. The same cream sweater moved through the afternoon sunlight. The same leather folder rested beneath her arm. Nothing about her appearance had changed since the moment she first stepped onto school property hours earlier. Yet everything around her had changed. Behind the glass entrance doors, teachers watched her leave. Parents remembered the assumptions they had made. The registration volunteer quietly greeted the next visitor with a warmer smile than she might have offered the day before. Even the security officer found himself asking more questions and making fewer conclusions. Principal Brooks remained standing near the entrance for several moments after Sarah disappeared from view. In 20 years of education, he had taught thousands of lessons, delivered hundreds of speeches, and hung banners celebrating achievement across the walls of his school. Yet the lesson he remembered most had arrived from a woman carrying no badge, no title, and no reason to prove herself to anyone. It had arrived in 10 quiet seconds between judgment and understanding. And somewhere inside Lincoln Heights Academy, long after the meeting ended and the hallways emptied, the building itself seemed to remember what dignity looks like.